careers. Prior to co-founding the Case Foundation, Jean spent her career as a technology executive in the private sector. She was a senior executive at AOL, where she directed the marketing and branding effort that launched the AOL service and led the communication strategy for taking the company public. And before joining AOL, Jean held strategic marketing positions at GE and The Source, which was the nation's first online service. Jean has also served in two very prominent appointed roles, leading important private-public efforts at the President's Council on Service and Civic Participation, to which she was named as the chair by President George W. Bush, and also as co-chair of the US-Palestinian Partnership. Jean serves on a number of boards, including the National Geographic Society Board of Trustees, and also fairly recently has begun to serve as an executive in residence at Georgetown University's Global Social Enterprise Initiative. I was talking to Jean a bit about how that works, and I was going to make the pitch later that a similar role here would be wonderful for our students too. She hadn't heard that before. Jean and Steve also joined, as I think most of you know, the Giving Pledge, started by Bill Gates and Warren Buffett in 2010, and publicly reaffirmed their commitment to give away the majority of their wealth to fund charitable causes. She is the recipient of numerous awards, too many to mention, but I'll just mention two. She was named the most admired CEO in 2013 by the Washington Business Journal, which also named her the Corporate Philanthropist of the Year. Please join me in welcoming Jean Case. There should be seats. Take a seat. We'll get started. So I thought I'll just show you quickly a very brief video that talks about an important campaign that Jean and her team at Case Foundation launched to promote innovation in the social sector. This is called the Be Fearless campaign. So there's a short video, and then we'll open it up. I'll lead with a few questions.
If you added up all the times you failed, all the times you came up short, would you try again? What if failure wasn't a limitation? What if taking risks was your status quo? What kind of world would you imagine? When global challenges seem overwhelming, we need to create unlikely partnerships, experiment with new thinking, and set audacious goals. To build a better world, to make a real difference, we have to take bigger risks, make bigger bets. And if we fail, and fail again, we have to get right back up, stronger than we were before. To live in a world worth living in, we have to let challenge inspire us. We have to take risks, be bold, and let urgency conquer fear. We have to be fearless.
Great. So let me just open up the conversation by asking you, Jean, a somewhat personal question. The campaign has been out for 2 years.
2 years, yeah.
I wanted to ask, what does it mean to you personally to be fearless in the context of philanthropy, technological innovation?
Sure. Well, first of all, thank you very much for that very kind introduction. And you saw we mentioned failure in that video. And I'm always struck by the way we get introduced in front of audiences, and it all sounds so perfect, doesn't it? But it was actually a road strewn with failures along the way. I think that is the experience, or has been the experience, of many people as they move through life, and particularly if they have the rare privilege of being part of something extraordinary. Usually to get to something extraordinary, you've taken risks. Usually if you've taken risks, you've failed. And the question is, what are you going to do about that failure? And obviously the point of that video is to say, get back up, dust off, keep going. So Dean Gent, you mentioned that I worked for The Source, which was the world's first online service. And if I'd done a little trivia question, wondering had anyone ever even heard of that?
They're too young for it.
Probably not. Probably not. But part of the reason you didn't hear about it is because it failed. But you know what happened? Because of that failure, we were able to fail forward, meaning with the next initiatives that came along to drive the democratization of ideas and access to communication and the very things that online services represented, we could fail forward, pick up from those failures, and be a little further along the line as the new online services came forward, and ultimately AOL, which was the one that really broke through. So I think that was our experience in our private sector career and in our personal lives. So then we came to philanthropy after spending time in a business that was really comfortable and understood that risk had to be part of innovating and growing. And we saw a sector that was really uncomfortable with risk. And we could have a lot of conversations around why that is, and you guys probably know a lot of this. But partly, in some philanthropies, they're actually managing someone else's money. Maybe that person is now long past, right? And it's a generation or two later. And imagine if I gave you my money to manage. Chances are you'd be pretty conservative with it. But if you're managing your own money, you might be more likely to take risks. So it's one of those, there are some sort of natural reasons why in philanthropy and in the change-making world, there's been risk aversion. The nonprofits, on the other side, as they seek grants from a lot of these philanthropists, don't necessarily feel they've been given permission to take risks, to fail. So what do we have? We have serious, daunting challenges facing the globe that have been with us a really long time. We need to find new ways to solve old problems. We have to take risks. So the Be Fearless campaign was really an effort to speak to a couple of different sectors. The funding sector, whether that be the government, whether that be philanthropies, whether that be high net worth individuals giving just to various causes, and to the nonprofit sector. But probably the most important message really has to go to the funding community, that they need to give permission to the causes and the organizations that they fund and direct to say some degree of risk is going to be okay, and in fact, not just okay, but really necessary if we're going to innovate and find new ways forward.
So I'm going to open it up very quickly. I just wanted to mention by way of framing that Nancy can speak to each of the following three areas and anything else that you might pose for her, but in particular, her background in innovating in the social sector. Also, technology as a source of good in the world, technological innovation as a source of good. And of course, investing for impact. She'll be speaking later, as most of you know, in Professor Fund's class on impact investing. So that topic, I suspect, will be pursued even at greater length. But the floor is really open to any of your questions. Yoni.
Thanks so much for...
Press the mic so that we capture it.
Yes, speak into the God mic. So, technology as a force of good. Kind of want to dig into that a little bit. I understand Khan Academy, let's take as an example.
Yeah.
Popular one at business school. Sorry, Dean Jane. So it's the theory is it's going to democratize education. I think the reality has shown that probably most of the gains go to people with opportunity who are facile with technology. So are you just charging forward an optimist, or is there some way to deal with
that?
Yeah,
it's a really fair question, and I honestly think, and before I answer your question, I just want to say I am here today because Nancy Fund asked me to come, and for those of you that haven't had the opportunity to know Nancy yet, Nancy is an unbelievable leader, and I think Yale is so fortunate to have her here, and I know she feels she's fortunate to have this opportunity at Yale. But I sit at her knee whenever I can, so I'm really excited. So welcome, Nancy, and thank you for being with us at lunch. So this technology thing, it's complicated. And I think what we don't want is this kind of view, which is, oh, technology's all good or technology's all evil. It turns out it's actually a mixed blessing. And the first major initiative that we got engaged in at the Case Foundation was an initiative around the digital divide, because we were so concerned about the opportunity gap represented by technology. And it's a little weird, and obviously the story changes as you move around the globe. You know, it's one story if we're talking about the US, in some cases different as we move around the globe. But there's no question that technology's brought all kinds of good. And I'm going to use an example of one we're really excited about present day. But we also realize it's displaced jobs. And actually, I think our passionate focus on private enterprise and entrepreneurialism to help solve problems in this world really comes out of the belief that private enterprise and sort of economic development is all that. And technology clearly has displaced some jobs that used to exist in the middle class and otherwise. And we're watching that and thinking about that. And we shall be mindful of that as we go into companies, as we invest in companies, et cetera. But we still see amazing power of technology to change the world. And I'm going to use two quick examples. We invested very early in some giving platforms that allowed democratization of giving. You know, I had said many times I don't think philanthropy should be defined as rich people writing checks. I think rich people should write checks, and big ones. And I think that you can see that belief in our joining of the Giving Pledge, okay? But the world will be a healthier place when everybody's locked arms and everyone is doing whatever's right for them. So these micro donation platforms are really exciting. We invested in about 3 of them. We put about $4 million of investment into them. And one all by itself, just last month, announced that it had surpassed $1 billion in micro donation giving since its inception. And that's technology-enabled giving, and that's not just for the most privileged amongst us. When you talk to who's giving there, it really is a broad swath of society. Now let's pivot to the global world. In sub-Saharan Africa and in Latin America, citizens are using their mobile phones to talk about, do I have access to clean water? Do I have an intervention in my community, a hand pump or otherwise? Is it working? Do I need someone to come and fix it? That doesn't sound like a really radical thing to you, except that it was only 3 years ago that we had to pay like $150,000 to send consultants out into the field in these places to say, is there a hand pump? Is it working? What do these people need? So really, for the first time in history, citizens are empowered in a really remarkable way with a very simple technology tool, a mobile phone. It doesn't even have to be a smartphone, to basically report back on the health of their communities, what their needs are, and to kind of flag when something is needed. So again, I think it's a mixed bag, but we're really excited by the potential on the positive sides.
I was reminded that about 3 weeks ago, Tom Friedman spoke on campus, and this was also an interesting topic of conversation, whether it's going to lead to some dystopian world where, drones
Right.
go around replacing humans, or what the potential is. But it's a topic that comes up quite often in a number of our forums. So
Yeah, and it should. I think it's an important conversation to have. But I think, in addition to Be Fearless, one of our sort of big initiatives that we've had for some number of years that really was some of the early piloting and experimenting around social media for good, operated under this umbrella called Citizens at the Center. And I think no matter who you are, whether you're a technology company, whether you're financial, it doesn't matter. If you have citizens at the center and the health and well-being of those citizens, that will guide you in the right place.
Mary Rose.
Thank you for being here with us today. My question is about how you decide to take risks, and I'm wondering if you can tell us a little bit about the framework around your thinking on which risks you decide to take, and
Sure.
also if you could give us an example of a risk you didn't take, like as an investment you didn't make or something you didn't support, and why.
Okay. So how we assess risk when we do business planning at the Case Foundation, which is a little unusual for foundations, let me tell you. I think is not representative of the sector more broadly, but it's just what fits for sort of our collective style as a team. We do competitive business planning, and then the team competes for sort of what's going to win. And it starts with looking at the big old problems that are daunting us out there, and they come up with great ways we can jump in and play a role. At the end of the year then, when we're looking at the next year's strategic planning and we've chosen those things, we grade them on a green, yellow, or red light. The greens are, no-brainer. We did what we were supposed to do. They did what they were supposed to do. We're measuring impact, or at least what we were trying to achieve as outcomes, and it's looking good. Yellow is, maybe, we're just not so sure. We need some more time to watch that, but we're a little concerned. Red is, didn't work. It's a fail. And I think it was an important moment, which was informed by our Be Fearless campaign, when we decided we wanted to have reds on purpose. And we told the teams, driving the programs forward, we don't think we're taking enough risks if we don't have some reds at the end of the year. Now imagine you're going to go out, right, and many of you have already been actively in careers, and you're going to want to succeed. You're going to want to show success. And I encourage you to do that. But if organizationally you can have a conversation around those areas where you're purposely deciding you're going to take a risk because it's not so clear where you need to go, it empowers you, much like I said, funders and nonprofits, it can empower you to try new things that you might not otherwise try if you weren't certain that they were going to pan out. So that's one of the ways that we measure our ongoing, are we taking enough risks? In terms of things we haven't done, it's funny because, again, with the frame of Be Fearless, we would, at the end of meetings as we were developing that work, we would say, okay, so we said we're going to go do this now, right? Yeah, but we're not going to do that, right? Well, let's unpack why we're not doing that. And I was stunned at the number of times fear was entering into the equation. It was either fear of not knowing enough, fear of looking stupid, fear of what will people think of us if this doesn't work. And what is more interesting to me than the things we didn't do is the things we first weren't going to do, but when we realized it was fear holding us back, we made the decision to push forward. And so an example of something that I think we sort of overcame fear with, we had a very large clean water initiative in Africa, and we talked about this before, and it was a huge high-profile thing. We had a lot of parties at the table with us, both in terms of funding and sort of their face on as part of this collaborative that we had put together. And it was targeted at 10 countries in sub-Saharan Africa, and it wasn't going so well. And it was really stressing me out. It was stressing out our entire team. And so we came around the table and said, okay, what are we going to do? And so, for some number of months, we course corrected. We tried, different things to see if we could get back on track. It was quite clear it was not going to get back on track. So we had a decision to face, and that was, were we going to sweep it under the rug? Were we going to just keep going, even though we knew it really wasn't working the way we had all hoped and dreamed it would? Or were we going to come clean? And we decided to come clean. And so I wrote a blog which was called The Painful Acknowledgment of Coming Up Short. And in it, I acknowledged it was a big fail. And the night before we pushed live on that blog was not a fun time. I absolutely had conversations with myself about, maybe I don't have to do this, actually. I mean, it was really, really a hard moment. But what happened is we put it out there, and immediately, oh my gosh, the feedback from our sector around, thanks, like no one ever talks about when they screw up. And it became really clear that it was almost like a welcome mat that enabled some people to come forward with their own failures. And now we do what we call liquid failure sessions. It helps if you get some wine or beer involved. We get groups together, and we invite them to come together to talk about their failures. And again, we're not really taking pride in our failures, but we are trying to say there's not shame in failure either. And that the most important thing you do if you do fail is to pick up and fail forward, fail fast, move on, and make sure others know about what you learned in that failure.
Great. Okay, let's take one from this. Ben.
I'm curious how those lessons translate into the public sector. So when politicians might take on a risky project or put a bill forward that might fail,
Right.
and if it does fail, they might lose campaign contributions, not be reelected, or they're perceived that they be gambling with public money.
Yeah.
I'm curious what types of structures can be imposed or used in the public sector to
Right.
encourage more risk.
Well, where we've really done a lot of work with the public sector, and a tremendous amount of work actually, is in the area of prizes and challenges. If you actually look back through history, there are some really remarkable things that have gone forward, some breakthroughs, some innovations because of prizes and challenges. And today we know about things like the X Prize, so think about that for a minute. But when we were engaging, we have the benefit of being about 6 blocks from the White House. We've worked closely with every administration. I think it just became sort of what we were known for, so once we did it a few times, it just became easier and easier to have those dialogues and to work in that sector. So we began having a conversation around what would it look like if we allowed our federal agencies and public sector funds to be used in prizes and challenges, with the idea being that maybe the smartest people in the world don't work for the government. How do we tap the intelligence out across the world? We were really successful in partnership with them and some other foundations. The president wrote an executive order compelling federal agencies to try prizes and challenges. We came together in a summit with the White House, and we had 35 agencies present with us. They were all trained in a workshop as to how to use these to try to find innovation. It was openly discussed. This is total risk. We're going to put stuff out there in the hopes that we get a big win, but we may fail across the board. But guess what? It was that permission thing that I talked about. So what happened? Well, a couple years went by, a lot of new things were tried. Not surprisingly, most things that were tried failed, but some of them were really quite dramatic in terms of the difference that they could make and the sort of outcomes that we saw. So we came back together after 2 years. We did a deep dive on what had been tried by each agency. This time we had many more agencies there. And a permanent house of challenge.gov, sort of an online house for prizes and challenges, was established. And if you look, I didn't look this morning, I look routinely, there's usually about 200 different prizes and challenges going on. So that's one way in the public sector we were able to find a way to introduce risk and find some really awesome innovations happening and engage citizens across the board. And we were kind of thinking there wouldn't be a backlash because we had locked arms with citizens too, right? We were asking them to come and be part of the solutions that we were going to take forward through their ideas.
I saw a bunch of hands up. Yeah, Laura.
Thank you for being here. One thing all of our first years do is take a class called Innovator. And we recently sort of learned that the difference between a failure and a mistake is learning. And so I'm wondering, in terms of those reds, those intentional red projects that do fail, I'm wondering if you would mind sharing a story about maybe what you're learning from those.
So, why don't I talk about the big failure that I just talked about, because that's probably easiest for me, just in terms of recall. In that particular case, we learned a lot, and we were able to pick up and transfer that to a new relationship we have today and have had for some number of years now with an organization called Water for People. But one of the things that we learned in that we could then apply, we were bringing one specific intervention to villages in what was called Play Pumps, which was our old initiative. And there we believed that this one initiative was just so right for various villages. I think we hadn't done enough work to really have, and it's crazy because we're citizens at the center, but we hadn't applied our own citizens at the center strategy, so that when we looked back, we said, you know what, we didn't really have full buy-in, nor did we fully understand how the villagers felt. It was just like, here's this thing, let's just go stamp it across villages. And of course, that wasn't really the attitude we brought to it, but that's ultimately, when we looked back, what we realized we had done. It turns out many interventions are needed, and it's going to vary, not surprisingly, village by village. We found out that Africa is a really, really far way away from Washington, D.C. And although we had on-the-ground partners, we didn't get that right. We needed a lot more coverage, and a lot more bridging between Africa and Washington in the effort, and also a lot more bridging between the partners that had represented the initiative. So those are just a couple of examples of things that it was like, we should have realized that. And then we were able to take that and form a new partnership to do similar things, and it's gone, pardon the pun, swimmingly well.
Yes, David.
Thank you. I'm hoping you can talk a little bit about how evolution occurs within the philanthropy field. You mentioned that the foundation is not necessarily representative of the way that things are done in other foundations, and I'm wondering how some of that cross-learning may or may not take place given what I see from the outside as fragmentation across different initiatives from Gates, from Skoll, from Rockefeller, from Ford.
Yeah, so I think I'm actually pretty optimistic, and if I had been here 10 years ago, I would not be optimistic. Because the world that I stepped into, which I felt like a total stranger to, I say often, I felt like I had someone else's clothes on as I transitioned from business into philanthropy. Hard, complicated, didn't know the players, didn't really know what I needed to know to be effective, and still am learning every day. But there was no collaboration going on among funders. None. They weren't talking to each other. There wasn't even a lot of stuff documented so that we could learn from each other. Really, it was crazy. So at AOL, we really had as our big nemesis Microsoft. But even we knew, we need to be talking. Like, we need to be understanding what's going on in the world that we're all trying to address. There are times when we had to come together in partnership around issues like privacy and digital divide, where we all shared a common interest. A lot of that just wasn't happening in philanthropy. But I am super encouraged by the change I've seen in the last 10 years. And if you look around today, you can actually see some really powerful collaboratives among not just living donor foundations like ours, but among the truly old line, almost IBM equivalents in the foundation world. And I'm super jazzed by it. I think it's going to hold the potential and the promise to really do amazing things. And then, of course, now we have also the impact of the Giving Pledge. And many of the Giving Pledge signers don't necessarily have foundations. So they're all free agents out there. And, the reason we really joined the Giving Pledge was so that we could create a new kind of human network together around things that we cared about and learn from them. And we're seeing that play out as well. And it isn't that it's important because they're wealthy people, it's that it's important because they have access to remarkable things. They are in many cases leading, the biggest, most influential organizations in the world. And then they have quite a bucket of assets combined that could be moved to do really significant things. So we lead what's called the Learning Series for the Giving Pledge. We're really super committed to this. And so about every quarter, we take a different topic and we bring sometimes outsiders in, like other foundations, and we share learnings together.
Jean, I wanted to ask you a bit about the foundation's work in supporting entrepreneurship, social entrepreneurship. As you know, this is a very large interest of our students. So if you could speak broadly about your foundation's support of entrepreneurship, especially social entrepreneurship.
Yeah, well, I think that, we are super believers that the entrepreneurial spirit is probably the greatest asset we can bring to solving the world's challenges. And I think that's true in the for-profit world, and I think that's true in the not-for-profit world. So what happened in the financial crisis in 2008 and 2009 is, for the first time in America, we saw the number of startups declining. And here I'm not just talking about social enterprises, but social enterprises weren't exactly flourishing either. And of course, we know that a lot of capital had dried up, so it sort of made sense to us. But we're quite concerned about it because we believe strongly that the entrepreneurial spirit and startups have been the economic engine in the United States. They've certainly driven all the job growth in recent decades, not big companies, but startups. So at the White House, we launched something called Startup America, which is a public-private initiative. And the whole goal of it was really to grow the number of startups in our communities across the nation, and to do so by creating regional hubs, providing mentors, paths to capital, various things that entrepreneurs need really to get started and then scale once they're started. That has been really important work that we believe in, because we said at the time, and if you can remember 2008 and 2009, and I don't know where you guys were then and how much attention you were paying to the scene, but I know you've looked at it in school. It really was a time where communities were really hurting, and we said there's no amount of philanthropy or public aid that can address businesses that leave a community. It's just never going to make up that gap or that difference. We need thriving economic development and opportunities in our community. So it was out of that we got deeply engaged in the work. Around social entrepreneurship, we're super, super excited about what we're seeing from social entrepreneurs, super, super excited about the kind of work that Nancy's doing in impact investing, and there where you're taking companies that are getting started that are just changing the world. And she has been quite prescient at knowing how to find them. And so we're excited by that too. So it's a combination of social entrepreneurs leading nonprofits and social entrepreneurs leading for-profits as well.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yeah, in the back.
Thank you so much. I'm Greg Grinberg. I'm the CEO of a technology company and social enterprise that's dedicated to making healthy eating easy for everybody. And my question for you is, we've recently become convinced that the best way to raise the capital that we need as a technology company and preserve our mission as a social enterprise is to use a funding instrument which is essentially an earn-out provision which would allow a charitable foundation to buy back the investors' shares such that over time our company will be majority owned by its own charitable foundation.
Okay.
And so I'm curious, just since you've been through the whole life cycle of a startup and now running a philanthropy, what your reaction is to that as a strategy to not only ensure that the social mission, but to signal the outside world that that's what we're committed to.
Are you a B Corp?
No, we're incorporated in Connecticut. We were incorporated before. I don't think we even have legislation yet.
Okay. And if B Corp was available to you, would you be a B Corp?
I'm not sure. I think the case law isn't really clear on what a B Corp means, and I think protection from shareholder lawsuits is one element of it, but I think that maybe being majority owned by a public charity, a 501c3 public charity, might be even a stronger signal than a B Corp. But I'm curious to hear your thoughts on that distinction.
Yeah, this is some of the stuff I hope we're going to get into in Nancy's class as well. I think there's all kinds of space for new financial engineering. And if anybody wants to argue that point, I would point you to cryptocurrencies, okay? Right. Who would have imagined them? Who would have? Honestly, we have this unbelievable, and Jade here and Allie there in the yellow are part of our team. We have this amazing team at the Case Foundation. And one thing we really love to do, we just get super jazzed by it, is to just do ideation. Like, the what if? Could you imagine it? And we think we're pretty good at this. And then you get something coming along like a cryptocurrency, which no one would have put on a whiteboard. come on, who would even think about that stuff? So I think what you're doing is some unique financial engineering to fund yourself. And I'd like to see many more models out there that I'm not smart enough to imagine today. I think it's interesting what you're doing. I think foundations struggle a little bit in this realm of impact investing. So you're a for-profit company right now, right? You have equity investors presently.
That's right.
Yeah. So foundations are nervous in the impact investing space, and they really break down into a couple of different kinds of categories. Some who figured it out and they're going boldly. Okay, one being Omidyar. You guys might know about Omidyar. And we literally have learned so much from working closely with Omidyar. But a lot of the big foundations are afraid of putting their money either through PRI or through their corpus into companies. And so one of the things that we need to work on is good guidance out of our government and out of our tax laws so that they feel freed up to do what you have in mind to do. So what I would say is you have probably a limited base of foundations that would feel comfortable playing in that space with you if your thinking is to tap existing foundations to replace that equity. But it's interesting. It's novel. I say go for it. Let me know what happens. I'm really interested.
I was reminded, go ahead.
No, I'm just saying thank you so much, and I'll be sure to do that. Thank you.
I was reminded of a very interesting exchange that took place during the inaugural conference when we moved into the building. One of the sessions was on the role of finance in the good society. And it had people like David Swenson, the Chief Investment Officer at Yale, the legendary David Swenson. It also had Jane Mandillo, who is a graduate of this program, runs the investment of the Harvard Corporation. It had Bob Schiller, the Nobel laureate. And there was an interesting exchange when David Swenson very provocatively quoted Paul Volcker, who had been in a previous session of the same conference. He said, quoting Volcker, that the most important financial innovation of the last 2 decades is the ATM machine. And David Swenson responded by saying, let me tell you about 3 important financial innovations just in the last year, and he named B corporations as one of them.
Right. Yeah.
Thank you for the question.
I do think, though, there's, and we're going to, like I said, we're going to talk about this in this next class, but I think there's a lot of investor confusion, both for investors who are at the table and investors who are sitting on the sidelines. And I think it's the reason a lot of investors are sitting on the sidelines, because they don't, like even my husband and I have debates when we make investments, whether they be debt or equity. We have debates around, so is that an impact company or that's not? And I could throw up 3 companies behind me and we could have a very healthy debate in here, they're not B Corps, about is that an impact investment or not. So one of the things we're trying to really drive in the sector until we have certifications that make clear, yes, this is judged or deemed to be beyond B Corp impact investing. I think intent has to be there. I think measurement has to be there, and transparency has to be there. And we're working with B Corp to say if we had those 3 things, could we have a new category that's almost like a B Corp light that enables companies to come forward and say, here's our intent, here's what we intend to measure along that social benefit, and here's how we promise we'll be transparent in reporting out on what we're doing about that.
Okay, let's take another question.
Hi, my name is Adnan Sari. Thank you for the talk on risk. I'm also starting a startup right now, so it's
great.
Good to hear. I had 2 questions. My first one was, there's a lot of talk about how it's no longer the federal government, but it's really cities that are the locus of entrepreneurship innovation. And coming from a policy background, this is like news to me. So how do you feel about the shift of people like Jim Clifton and Bruce Katz saying that the future of America is in the city, forget federal government? And then the second question is just an optional question. If you were us, what question would you ask yourself, and then how would you answer it?
Can you remind me of the second question after I answer the first?
Yeah.
Okay. So I think the cities thing is really cool. But I am always leery whenever, and too many of our Silicon Valley friends say this. I don't know, Nance, if you feel the same way. Forget the federal government. We're better. We're like smarter. Come on. The federal government really matters, and they're a super, super powerful tool to leverage. So any attempt at change that disses something like a government probably isn't approaching it in the most balanced way. But this issue of cities, we're seeing tremendous heat from foundations, from companies, from some funds, et cetera, recognizing that, wow, a city approach could really be an interesting breakthrough kind of way. And while I think there's a lot of shared learnings that can inform all the cities, our own experience and the little bit of participation we've had in that is that every city is going to be really different. And we took the Case Foundation to Detroit last fall and really sort of went to school on Detroit and had citizens of Detroit and leaders from Detroit kind of show us what was what there. Because if you want to look at a city that's greatly, greatly challenged and in need of innovation, Detroit is a bright, shining model. And again, going back to 2008 when we started Startup America, what I said at the time was, heck, we're just going to bring home all the stuff we've been doing in the developing world. Because, I've been working on the same things in the West Bank as Detroit needs. I mean, that's just the bottom line. So I think we're also tilting into a place where some of the solutions we will look outside the United States to find, not inside the United States, but bring them here. And for some Americans, that's like really uncomfortable, right? I think it's going to happen.
I'll remind you of the second question. I just quickly wanted to mention that there's a review in the most recent issue of the New York Review of Books by Jeff Madrick of 2 books that actually have a lot of evidence about the role of government in spurring innovation, etc. So apparently, according to the review, the evidence is quite conclusive about the claim that Jean just made. Yeah.
No question. Basic research particularly. I mean, so many of the things we enjoy and that companies have been built off of, we give the companies credit when, in fact, if you peel back that onion, it was the government funding the basic research.
Yeah.
Your second question?
It was, if you were us, what question would you ask yourself and how would you answer it?
I don't know. Okay, so this is not really, it sort of is about social enterprise, but I mean, and like I hope there's an eye roll when I say this, just hear me out. What do I love? When do I thrive? because, you know, that nicely led bio that he read of mine is actually a very crooked road. And I think when you get on the other side of youth and you look back, you realize the things that you could be great at is where you have a great love and a great passion. And, you know, if you're thinking about going into a career or a sector and it doesn't really like touch you in your soul, find something else. Because you can change the world in a lot of ways, and we've talked about many of them. But I haven't seen many people change the world who didn't truly love or almost have, in some cases it might not be love, it just might be a burning passion to make a difference in some way. And so if you're not feeling that, then chances are you're not going to be as great as you otherwise could be. And parents really hate it when I talk to kids about this, you know, because some parents really say, no, you're going to be a lawyer, and that's just what you're going to do. But I think there's just a lot of evidence around this, and I think too often when older people say it to people who are younger, they go, yeah, everybody says love what you do. But it's because it's like actually a way that you can have the most success in life.
Mm-hmm. Great. Yes, Dan.
Hi, so you're very encouraging of people to start new social enterprises, but you acknowledge that there's a lot of red lights, ones that don't even get started or fail or what have you. Well, we're all in school right here and we're looking to grow our skill sets. So my question is what skills do you think are lacking in the social enterprises that don't work?
Yeah, so I would say not just social enterprises, but the same often is true in the public sector, in the nonprofit sector, and maybe a little bit in the philanthropy sector too. So we started an initiative with partners when I was chairing the President's Council called Billion Plus Change. And at that time, it was started because we had canvassed the nonprofit sector and discovered there were skill areas that were absolutely lacking. Not our assessment, them telling us that, okay? And those were some areas like technology, marketing, business planning, finance, recruiting, okay? And, you know, when we said, well, who has that? Well, the private sector has it. The nonprofit sector didn't. So we got a consortium of companies to agree to what was first a goal of $1 billion in pro bono talent, specifically in those areas, infused into nonprofits. And that then quickly grew to $2 billion, and we have over 500 companies participating. But the reason I start with that is, okay, so now you're a team, you've got a startup. You need to make sure that the kind of things that can lead to scale and sustainability you have represented on your team. And you know, a founder usually has a passion around the core business area, but sometimes is utterly lacking in some other areas that are every bit as necessary to take that business forward and make something big out of it, but doesn't have the ability to see that. So I would say, you know, look around at your team and do an audit of your core skills, experiences, knowledge base. Make sure you have a mentor and actually a board right from the start, because the value of, and you know this too well, right? The value of someone sitting on the outside looking in, for me, we just had our board meeting 2 days ago and we were all like, oh my gosh, we need to do this even more often than we're doing it. Because outside looking in is a really valuable perspective. And when you're waking up and like crashing to run a company or a new social enterprise every day, it's really hard to step back and say, here's what we're missing, or here's what we need to do. So those are just some thoughts.
I had the self-congratulatory thought that in answering your question about what skills are lacking, Jean mentioned a number of things that are sort of core to your educational experience. You know, but it's not just that.
I have to remember who I'm talking to here. I apologize.
No, that was not my comment. I was just feeling smug about that.
As well you should be.
Yes. Patrick.
My question is around impact measurement.
Yeah.
And when the goal is systemic change, and we're trying to collaborate with other funders, how do you actually measure that when you have levels of impact at the project level, potentially the portfolio level, but really the goal is systemic change?
Right. So there are a couple of different ways to look at that. When we get engaged in an initiative or funding, you know, something, okay, we always have an articulated view of how we look at ROI. And you might imagine that if we're funding a nonprofit, it might look a little different than how we look at ROI if we're funding a company that we're trying to see change in. But the area of social metrics, and this I think will be a really big challenge in impact investing, measuring that is tricky business. So do you guys want to make a really huge contribution to the planet and to humanity for all time? Help figure out this metrics thing, because no one's really figured it out. And even we, in our own work, are struggling with how we take a longitudinal view, because what we discovered is that some things we might have either done a yellow or red light on and pulled a plug, but that's the exception, but there are one or two of them. Or we look back and said, didn't really feel so great about that, but it was green. We wait 5 years, and they come back and go, but you don't understand. Because you did that catalytic investment, it took like 4 or 5 years, and then we were able to blah, 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 and we go like, oh my gosh, that's a totally different view of return on investment. So these things are hard, but I think that, do you remember before I said intent, measurement, and transparency? If we had more of that in everything as it relates to social change, it would get us closer to how we look at impact. It's just truly, utterly lacking. I'm working with USAID in a collaborative right now of leaders where we're looking at how they measure, and surprisingly enough, they measure inputs, right? How many dollars did we spend? How many people did we give shots to? How many? They weren't overly focused on outcomes and lives saved. And you go like, well, wait, like, $12 billion a year, and you never really said like, okay, how do we actually tell the story of the impact? So this is a problem across the board for anyone who cares about making a better world. And you guys with your truly awesome Yale education might think about like what role you could play in helping to solve that, because I don't really have all the answers.
Natalia.
So a little bit related to the question, do you feel that this drive towards metrics in a way stifles innovation in the development like social impact sector? Because if as a startup or a nonprofit wants you to like invest or like they want to get a grant,
right?
They may be like, oh well, I need to show clear metrics, so there's like a tension there.
We say we have a love-hate relationship with data. And the reason for that is there's not enough data, as we just talked about, to really inform us in many areas where we need to be informed. But too many people rely on data before they get engaged in something. And our favorite quote here is Henry Ford, who said, and you guys might have already learned this in your classes, if I'd asked people what they wanted, they would have said faster horses. So, innovation comes at imagining what hasn't been done. There is no data for the unforeseen, for the new. You will be that data. And you heard me say earlier, please be that data. Be that data if you're a success, be that data if you're a failure. So it really is, there's two parts to that answer. One is we don't spend enough time looking at measurement in areas where we could be informed and be better and have more impact. And then in other places, we got to say there is no measurement that justifies us. We're going in. We're all in. And we're not armed, and we're going to try something crazy here.
Thank you for being here. I'm Brian Eckstein, a joint business and environment student here. Combining the ideas of permission to fail and focus on impact. Failure has real implications. Sometimes for a foundation, it's lost capital or lost funds. For investors, lost capital. For individuals, it's a lost job and perhaps lost jobs for employees. Given that we want to achieve impact, but we also want to allow people the safety in which to innovate, what do you think needs to change on a broader social compact level and perhaps within an organization? What provisions and evaluation metrics need to be in place that you do feel safe to innovate?
So thanks for bringing that up. We're putting out a toolkit on Be Fearless, and we're hard at work on it at the foundation because I've sat in front of literally thousands and thousands of people in the last 2 years talking about this stuff, and the question always comes up, come on, be real. Like, my organization is never going to do that, or how do I begin? And so we really felt like we had to put a toolkit together, like where do I get started and how do I know, and how do we manage like the risk perspective, because we're not talking about reckless risk, obviously. So if you you know, you think about, on some of the things you just talked about, if you think about philanthropy as 100% loss of capital, which is most of our work at the foundation, right? When we write checks, we are not expecting capital back in return. We're looking at a different kind of return on investment. But then you swing way over to just a pure financial interest, market rate return or better. There's a lot of space to play in there, and I think every entity, every individual has to decide, well, where am I on that? You know, is 95% of my portfolio going to be about capital return, but I do think I could possibly fail or lose over here on 5%. Those are the kind of, I think, you know, balances that you have to have. And in this toolkit, we're going to say, because this is what I've done in working with boards who are asking the question, like, how do we get started? It might be one thing a year you do, right? It totally depends on you and your organization. It might be 10%. We've seen some foundations, and I bet Nancy knows them too, that have gone toe in the water, 1% impact investing to today being 100% impact investing. We've seen Kellogg, an old line, you know, foundation. They have $100 million now that they're deploying to impact investing every year. So for every organization, it's going to be different, and we're going to try. We've got a screen that we start with, which is a self-assessment around, well, where are you now? Like, how do you look at failure? Are you risk averse? Are you more risk tolerant? And then the baby steps to how you begin to do it. But again, their intent and clear transparency and report out around, this is what we said we would do together, this is what we did, and now we're reporting out to say what the results were.
So I was going to ask a question because I was intrigued in reading your bio, Jean. So this question might be of particular interest to our students. The Case Foundation has been involved in supporting the Next Gen Millennial project. I was curious what that is. What do you do to engage millennials?
Right. Well, actually, the reason I'm here today is because of these remarkable people, but really because of you guys. And I think that, you know, it's not like a radical concept that we look to the next generation as the future. You know, brands learned this a long time ago and tilted a lot of their efforts towards that generation. But I think in the world I live in, which is where we're trying to create a better world, they haven't been so smart about realizing the strategic nature of dealing with next gen. And I mean, no matter how hard I work for the rest of my life, chances are I really have a limited ability to change the world. This next generation will determine if there's a better planet, a better humanity. And what I really love is they bring all kinds of differences for the first time. You know, things like, you know, if I was talking at Yale 25 years ago or 40 years ago, you guys would be so in your silos by now. You'd know if you're going into law, if you're going into business, if you're going into government. The world's changed, driven largely by millennials who say, I just want to like change stuff. Can't I have a little bit of all of that? And like the idea that, you know, here at the School of Management, there's an impact investing course. That's just in some ways radical and cool. And so the reason that we are so deeply engaged in the work with millennials is because we believe they can inform us and help us sort of, you know, guide our efforts towards more innovation. But more importantly, they're already changing society, and they're going to really introduce a new day when it comes to really being able to break through in some innovations to change the world.
Great. Yeah.
Another one off. So this summer I'll be at the OMB next door to you, and I recently read that 29% of the federal workforce is retirement age. So we'll get a new swath of potential millennials. I'm wondering, this is kind of a question about how angry we feel about the federal government's dysfunction. I'm wondering if you can help us feel optimistic, either about the bureaucracy shifting, or maybe you've worked with some Tea Party people that you like, or is there anything you could say?
Yes, and yes. Yes, yes, and yes. I mean, the division in Washington is really bad. There's just no question about that, and it's really, really discouraging at times. But I think, you know, it's important as we look to the future, and this is what I love about this disrupted age, and it's why, you know, I really listen carefully when you guys talk, okay? Reinvent it, man. I mean, because, you know, even this whole debate over money and politics, blah, 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 you know what that money is going to? Buying TV ads. Is anyone going to be watching TV? Is that really where people are going to be getting their political, views? 10, 20 years, ain't going to happen. I mean, so we're debating over all these things that have nothing to do with the potential for the future to play out in a meaningful way. So think about, how can you disrupt? How can you disrupt? Because if we follow the same old way and just hope it gets better, it's not. But I don't consider that discouragement. I consider that encouragement for, let's go build a different way. And for instance, when President Obama was elected, independent of politics here, okay? When he was elected, everybody understood that the role of the young generation and the micro donations played a pretty powerful role in getting him elected. I think many people in Washington, and maybe some in this room, think we didn't really pick up on that and run with that in his presidency. We didn't leverage that fully. That can be leveraged in a future election. And that can change how Washington works. And it can drip down to Capitol Hill, which is where the real problem is. So, like, reimagine, what is the Bitcoin of politics that nobody even is putting on a board today? And, see if you can get some smart people together, energetic people who want to work really hard and do new stuff and make something happen.
So let's take one last question and we'll wrap up. Yeah, Patrick, again.
In the same vein, given the foundation's tie to the Social Innovation Fund, I wonder if you could speak to the success of that program.
Yeah, so I will. And before I do that, let me just also say that a secret sauce for us that's enabled us on this political front to work the way we have is that we don't send money to PACs. We're not out there on behalf of one party or another. We've worked with and in some cases for different administrations, et cetera. And I think if you go out into the world, we do believe there's this passionate center that wants to emerge and the voice hasn't really gone forward. If you can find some way to go across both those lines. Now, the Social Innovation Fund, I don't know if you're referring to it, but last time I was at Yale, I had one of our great colleagues who's a senior vice president of ours, Michael Smith, and just last summer he went to run the Social Innovation Fund for the White House. He's shaken things up. We used to say, and Sonal Shah, by the way, who actually created it, is a senior fellow at the foundation. I know she's been here. I don't know how many of you had the chance.
She's spoken at the Philanthropy.
To hear her. She's just a rock star. But we did say in the earliest days, I'm just going to be really honest with you, we don't see a lot of innovation in the Social Innovation Fund because a lot of the money was going to the traditional nonprofits. I think they're learning a lot as time goes by. I think Michael in his new role is innovating. And I think we should celebrate that there is something called a Social Innovation Fund, even if it's not as innovative as we would love. The fact that we're trying to get to innovation with the way public dollars are driven is a really, really exciting thing. And so we're all in and behind him and his effort to really find smarter ways to deploy capital from the public sector.
Great. So I wanted to thank you, Jean, for the warmth and thoughtfulness with which you have engaged us. I wouldn't attempt to summarize this very wide-ranging and comprehensive conversation, but perhaps I'll just, in closing, repeat a few phrases that caught my particular attention from this conversation. Be fearless, fail often, fail forward. What do I love? How and why and where do I thrive? And finally, the Bitcoin of politics. Thank you so much.
Thanks, everyone. A real delight.